The 2008 Singapore Grand Prix was arguably one of the biggest F1 scandals ever. And while it was now 15 years ago, somehow it's back in the news after Felipe Massa has stated his intention to legally question the validity of the race and as such the 2008 championship. Let's just back up for a minute and take a breath. There are some details you're going to need to know to understand exactly why this is being brought back up. First of all, 2008 was Lewis Hamilton's first World Championship with McLaren, and he won it in dramatic fashion on the last lap of the Brazilian Grand Prix. It was actually pretty unbelievable. Timo Glock slowed in the last few corners, allowing Lewis Hamilton to get 5th place and the points he needed to clinch the championship. What made matters worse is that Felipe Massa's side of the garage, including his father, celebrated thinking he'd actually won, when in fact he hadn't. They didn't realise Lewis had got up to 5th. So why is Felipe Massa bringing this back up now? Well, the Singapore Grand Prix scandal, also known as Crashgate, cost Felipe Massa quite dearly that year. And after recent comments made by Bernie Ecclestone, yeah, him again, it turns out that all was not quite fair. Oh no, the FIA governing body not being fair and just? Say it isn't so, I am shooketh. So what was this scandal? Well, Fernando Alonso was racing for Renault back then, and he wasn't having a particularly good season. Nor did he have a good qualifying result at the Singapore Grand Prix, and he started the race in 15th. Felipe Massa led the race early on, and just after Fernando Alonso pitted, his teammate Nelson Piquet crashed just before the stadium section and brought out a safety car. Back then, refueling was still very much a thing, and initially the pit lane was closed. But because some cars would run out of fuel if they didn't refuel, they were forced to pit, and they got stop-and-go penalties. Then, when the pit lane reopened, any car that hadn't already stopped was forced to, and the Ferraris had to double stack behind each other. If that wasn't bad enough, Felipe Massa then had a nightmare pit stop, leaving his pit box with the fuel hose still attached. It then wouldn't release and cost him an enormous amount of time, putting him all the way to the back of the grid. To cut the story a little short, Fernando Alonso would then go on to win the race, after cars who were ahead of him at the time but hadn't pitted were then forced to pit, and the ones that did pit when the pit lane was closed received their penalty. Alright, you say, well, why is this important? So what? Sometimes a little bit of luck goes your way. Well, at the time, that's what you would have said. But afterwards, a different story started to emerge, and it turned out Nelson Piquet crashed intentionally to bring out the safety car for his teammate. A massive storm ensued, with Nelson Piquet claiming Pat Symonds, Renault's executive director of engineering, asked him to deliberately crash to help out his teammate. Symonds and team principal Flavio Briatore would eventually just blame each other, and both would receive bans from Formula 1. Symonds did return later though, after his ban was overturned, and he is now the current chief technical officer of Formula 1 itself. This was a huge scandal. The idea that a driver would crash intentionally, not just endangering themselves but also their fellow drivers, marshals and fans, was pretty unbelievable. Renault were not disqualified though. Oh no. They received a 2-year suspended disqualification, which meant that they would only be actually disqualified if they did something like that again. Essentially, they got away with it. They did lose their title sponsor ING though, and well, you know, reputation is everything. So why is this all coming up now? Once it turned out exactly what had happened, I think Felipe Massa believed that the trophy had been handed out and nothing was ever going to change that, and he was probably right. But now, recently, Bernie Ecclestone, being the person he is, has decided to open his mouth and claim that he and Max Mosley, who was the president of the FIA back then, knew about the rule breach during the 2008 season and chose not to act. This is what Bernie said. "We decided not to do anything for now. We wanted to protect the sport and save it from a huge scandal. That's why I used angelic tongues to persuade my former driver Nelson Piquet to keep calm for the time being." Back then, there was a rule that a World Championship classification after the FIA awards ceremony at the end of the year was untouchable. So Hamilton was presented with a trophy and everything was fine. We had enough information in time to investigate the matter. According to the statutes, we should have cancelled the race in Singapore under these conditions. So why bring this up now? Well, I actually think this is more about Lewis Hamilton than anything else. Bernie Ecclestone has a bit of a history and a pattern of trying to diminish Lewis Hamilton at any opportunity, and it feels like he's suggesting Lewis Hamilton would not have been champion if this result had stood. And that may be the case, but it may not. Massa could have still had his terrible pit stop regardless, but the bigger concern is that the FIA knew what Renault had done, but decided it was in the interests of the sport to let them get away with it. I actually think this has happened on more than one occasion, to be honest. Not to fuel the fire, but when Ferrari had their jet engine, it was a very hush-hush FIA agreement that eventually reduced their performance. Regardless of any of that, none of it was Lewis Hamilton's fault. And this is a race from 15 years ago. I can completely understand why Felipe Massa would feel hard done by given these revelations, but the FIA weren't too keen to reverse Abu Dhabi in 2001, despite getting rid of Michael Masi and admitting the rules weren't entirely followed. Do we really think they're going to null and void a race from 2008 and change the world champion? No, they're not. It would be absurd. Not to mention, who really believes what comes out of Bernie Ecclestone's mouth? It does remind me though of just how easily people forget these things. I'm pretty sure if Crashgate happened today, it would be a massive monster, especially with social media and the pressure to punish teams for cheating. So no, I don't think anything will come of this, but I do think Bernie Ecclestone isn't quite done with poking the bear. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.